Good evening, friend. If you have found your way here, it likely means the day has finally loosened its grip on you, and you are looking for somewhere quiet to land. This is a good place for that. Turn the lamp down low if you have not already. Let the blanket settle over you the way a good coat settles over cold shoulders. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight. Tonight we are going somewhere small and hushed, and I think more interesting than it first appears. We are going into a breakfast room on the second floor of a Manhattan townhouse in the autumn of 1926, where a silver tray has just been set down on a white cloth. On it sits half a grapefruit, its flesh scored into careful sections with a spoon that will do more work than the fork beside it. There is a cup of black tea going cool. There is a folded newspaper nobody has opened yet. And there is a woman standing at the window in a silk wrapper, looking down at the street, in no hurry to sit down and eat. We will spend the whole of tonight with her, and with women very much like her, because their mornings and afternoons and evenings hold something that has mostly been left out of the history we were handed. Not the dresses, not the parties, the plainer, quieter discipline that ran underneath all of it, the discipline of the body itself, and how one specific generation of women learnt to manage their own hunger the way their fathers managed a household ledger. It is a gentle story tonight, not a hard one. There is no scandal waiting at the end of it, no villain to point to. There is only a woman, a house, a day, and the strange, very human arithmetic of trying to fit yourself into a shape the world has decided is fashionable. You may recognize more of it than you expect. People usually do. There will be no loud moments in the hours ahead, nothing that asks you to sit up or pay closer attention. We are simply going to walk through a single day, slowly, the way you might walk through an old house with someone who has lived there their whole life, pausing wherever there is something worth pausing over. So settle in. Let your eyes close if they want to close. You do not have to remember any of this by morning. That is rather the point of an evening like this one, to let history do for once what it rarely gets to do, which is simply keep you company while you rest. Let us go inside. The subject tonight is food of all things, or rather the deliberate absence of it. Specifically, we are looking at what wealthy and fashionable women in the middle of the 1920s actually ate and did not eat in the name of a new silhouette that had swept in almost overnight and rewritten what a fashionable body was supposed to look like. The picture most people carry of this decade comes from a handful of photographs and a handful of films. The beaded dress, the cropped hair, the long cigarette holder tilted at an angle. It is a lovely picture, and it is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that matters. The textbooks give you the date the hemlines rose. The films give you the fringe and the feathers. Neither one tends to show you the bathroom scale by the door, or the half grapefruit eaten in silence, or the tightness of a rubber garment worn under a dress that was designed deliberately to look as though nothing at all was worn underneath it. Neither one tends to show you the ordinary exhaustion of it, the sheer number of hours a fashionable woman spent in a single day thinking about food she was not eating. That is the part of the story we are stepping into tonight. Not to judge it, I want to be honest with you about that from the outset, because it would be easy to sit here from 100 years' distance and shake our heads at what these women did to their own bodies. That is not what tonight is for. These were not foolish women. They were responding, the way people in every era respond, to a set of expectations that had arrived faster than anyone's habits could keep up with, and they did what people have always done with an impossible standard, which is find a way to live inside it anyway. Before we go any further, if evenings like this one suit you, if you like the feeling of history as a room you can actually sit in rather than a page you have to memorize, I would be glad if you would take a moment to subscribe. It is a small thing on your end, and it means more than you would think on mine, mostly because it lets me keep doing this. And if you are willing, tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what the hour happens to be where you are. I read every one of them, usually the next morning with a cup of tea of my own. Wherever you happen to be right now, I am glad of the company. By the time we reach the end of tonight, I think you will understand the grapefruit half and the rubber girdle and the yeast cakes rather differently than you do right now. Not as strange period curiosities, the sort of thing that gets a laugh in a museum exhibit, but as the visible edge of something much larger, a whole private economy of hunger and denial and quiet endurance that ran underneath the glamour of the era like plumbing under a house. It is the 15th of September 1926. The morning is cool enough that the windows in the townhouse are still shut. Somewhere below, in the kitchen, a cook is slicing a grapefruit in half with a knife she keeps only for that purpose. Let us go down and see the world this house sits inside of before we go up and meet the woman waiting for her tray. It is 1926, and Manhattan is a city building itself upward and outward at the same time, as if it cannot decide which direction it wants to grow. Along Fifth Avenue, the department store windows are lit late into the evening, dressed with headless mannequins wearing dropped waist dresses in shades the catalogues call oyster and dove and nude. A word that would have made an earlier generation blush and now simply describes a stocking. Up on Park Avenue, a new apartment tower is going up where a row of brownstones used to stand, and the workmen on the scaffolding whistle now and then, just to hear the sound carry down 12 stories to the street. The Woolworth building still holds its title as the tallest thing on the skyline, a pale spire visible from blocks away on a clear morning like this one, and the subway carries its usual crowd of clerks and typists underground, while the more fashionable traffic stays up on the surface streets where it can be seen. Below them, the city moves the way it always moves in the mornings. Milk wagons still make their rounds behind old draft horses, because it will be a few more years yet before every dairy in the city trades hooves for tires, and the horses leave their smell behind them, warm and grassy. Mixed in with the coal smoke rising from 1,000 chimneys and the tang of exhaust from the automobiles now crowding in around them, newsboys stand on the corners with the morning editions folded under one arm, calling out headlines about the stock market and the Yankees and whatever scandal happened to break overnight. And their voices carry up and over the sound of the elevated train 2 blocks over, which announces itself the way it always does, with a long metal shriek followed by a rattle that shakes the windows of every building close enough to feel it. This is the middle of the decade now, the part people would later shorthand into a single word, jazz, though the word never quite captured how much of the era was actually built on quiet arithmetic rather than noise. Prohibition is in its 6th year, which means the city has become extremely creative about where a drink might be found and extremely practiced at pretending not to notice. A woman walking past a tea room on a Tuesday afternoon might glance in the window and see nothing unusual at all. Ladies in cloche hats bent over cups of tea and small plates of nothing much, and she would have no way of knowing, unless she was already part of that world herself, that some of those cups held considerably more than tea. The morning papers, folded under the newsboys' arms, carry their usual mixture: a senator's speech on farm prices, a report on the Yankees' pitching staff, a small item, tucked well back from the front page, about a new health resort opening somewhere in New Jersey, promising baths and massage and a supervised diet for wealthy women who wish to lose 10 pounds before the winter season begins. Nobody reading it over breakfast this morning thinks it is strange that such a place should exist, or that anyone would pay handsomely to be told, by a stranger in a white coat, to eat less than she already knows she should be eating. It is simply one more advertisement among the corset notices and the motorcar notices and the notices for hair tonic, absorbed into the ordinary texture of the morning news the way weather is absorbed, noticed and then forgotten within the hour. A chestnut vendor has set up his cart early on the corner nearest the park, though the weather has not quite turned cold enough yet to make his fire smell like anything more than a promise of the season to come. And a delivery boy on a bicycle threads between the milk wagons, with a telegram tucked into his satchel, whistling something that might be a popular song or might be nothing at all. Church bells somewhere to the south mark the half hour, faint under the traffic. This is a city that has not yet decided, on any given block, whether it belongs to the horse or the automobile, and it will go on not deciding for a few years longer, the two of them sharing the street the way two eras always share a street for a while before one of them finally gives up the ground. September in this part of the city carries its own particular scent underneath everything else, damp stone from the last rain. The first fallen leaves going soft and sweet where they collect against the curbs. A trace of wood smoke from somewhere a household has lit its first fire of the season a week or two early. It is the kind of morning that asks for a good coat rather than a heavy one, and the women stepping out onto their front stoops this morning have judged the weather correctly almost without exception, each one wrapped in exactly the right degree of wool for a day that cannot quite decide itself whether it belongs to summer or to what comes after. The clothes tell you almost everything about what this era wanted from a woman's body, if you know how to read them. 10 years earlier, in 1916, the fashionable silhouette still had a waist you could find with your hands, a bust the corset lifted and rounded, hips that a good tailor knew how to flatter rather than hide. The whole architecture of a woman's dress assumed a woman's shape underneath it and did its work in cooperation with that shape. By 1926, all of that has been quietly abandoned. The fashionable dress now hangs straight from the shoulder, dropping its waistline down near the hip in a line that has nothing to do with where a woman's actual waist happens to sit. And it wants, more than anything else, for there to be as little shape underneath it as possible. Flat where a bust used to be. Narrow where hips used to curve, a boy's build on a grown woman's frame, which is precisely the word the era used for it without any embarrassment at all. The boyish figure, the Garonne look, borrowed in spirit from the young men who had come home from the war several years thinner and harder than they had left, and now handed to their sisters and wives as the new standard of elegance. It is worth pausing on how fast this happened, because it happened very fast. A woman who came of age admiring the Gibson girl silhouette, all curve and corset and abundance, found herself by her late 20s expected to produce the opposite of everything she had been taught to consider beautiful, and to do it without any of the structural help a corset used to provide. The old garments hid a great deal. The new ones, cut from silk and crêpe-de-châle that clung and moved and caught the light, hid almost nothing. A dress like that does not forgive an extra pound the way a heavily boned corset used to. It reports on the body underneath it with an honesty that no fashionable body had been asked to withstand in living memory. Some of the change traces back further than most people realize, to a handful of Parisian designers a decade or more earlier who had begun loosening the corset even before the war, arguing that a woman's body ought to move more freely under her clothes. What those designers intended as a kind of liberation, freedom of movement, freedom from whalebone, arrived on this side of the ocean transformed into something considerably stricter than what it replaced. An entire trade of corsetières, women who had spent careers fitting and lacing and adjusting, found their own businesses reshaped almost overnight, some of them retraining to sell the new rubber and elastic girdles instead, because the old skill of building a shape around a body had simply been replaced by a newer, less forgiving demand that the body arrive already in the shape required. The economics of this world run in their own register too, one worth understanding before we go any further, because it explains who could even attempt this new silhouette, and who could not. A working girl in a garment factory or a telephone exchange might earn somewhere in the neighborhood of $15 to $20 a week, and out of that she pays for her room, her food, her stockings, which run through faster than any other item she owns. A loaf of bread costs somewhere around a dime. A quart of milk runs about 28 cents. A furnished room in a respectable boarding house might take $4 or $5 a week on its own, before a single meal is bought. That same working girl, if she wanted to follow the fashion pages at all, would need most of a week's wages simply to buy one of the cheaper ready-made versions of the dress Helena will wear tonight without a second thought, which is one reason the new silhouette, however democratic it looked on a page, remained in practice a fashion largely reserved for women who did not need to count what any of it cost. The women we are following tonight live several floors above that arithmetic. Their households run on money that arrives from a husband's law practice or brokerage or family holdings, and it shows in everything. In the townhouses with their own staff. In the dressmaker who visits rather than the other way around. In the ability to simply not eat a meal without anyone downstairs asking why. But the pressure of the new silhouette does not respect that difference in income the way you might expect. If anything, it presses harder on women who have the means to be looked at constantly, at luncheons and dinners and the opera and the department store, because visibility, in this world, is itself a kind of currency, and a fashionable figure is one of the few things about a woman that everyone in the room can appraise on sight, without needing to know a single fact about her husband's income or her family's name. Walk 2 blocks east from Fifth Avenue and the city changes register entirely. Here the streets narrow, the buildings crowd closer together, and the smell shifts from exhaust and department store perfume to something denser, cooking oil and coal ash, and the close smell of a tenement hallway in the middle of a working day. Children play in the street because there is nowhere else for them to play. A pushcart vendor calls out prices on apples and second-hand shoes. This is the city too. The same year, the same month, an easy walk from the townhouses we are about to enter, and it is worth remembering it is there. Because the women we will spend tonight with are not unaware of it. Most of them give to some charity connected to it, attend a benefit or two each season, write a check without ever quite walking those blocks themselves, but turn back toward Gramercy Park, and the city softens again. The park itself sits behind its wrought iron fence, locked, its key held only by the households whose addresses face it, a small green rectangle of order in the middle of everything else. The townhouses around it are brick and brownstone, 4 and 5 stories, built decades earlier for exactly this kind of household and still doing exactly this kind of work. A few of the old families who built these houses have already sold and moved further uptown, replaced by newer money that has learned, quickly, which fork to use and which topics to avoid at dinner, and the neighbors nod to one another on the front steps each morning with the careful, cordial distance of people who have decided to like each other without necessarily choosing to know each other. Well, lace curtains hang in the windows. A brass door knocker gets polished every morning by someone whose job it is to polish it. Behind one door on the north side of the square, a house is waking up. Inside, the morning has already started in the kitchen, 2 floors below, where anyone upstairs will eventually sit down to breakfast. A cook named Mrs. Doyle is standing at the counter with a knife in one hand and a grapefruit in the other, cutting it in half with the same practiced motion she uses every morning at this hour. Because this has become, without anyone ever announcing it as a rule, simply what breakfast is now, in this house, for the woman who will come down to eat it. Let us go up and meet her. Her name is Helena Whitcomb, and on this September morning she is 29 years old. Though she will tell you, if asked, and she rarely is asked, that she prefers not to count from her wedding day so much as from the day she stopped being someone's daughter and became, instead, someone's wife. She married Charles Whitcomb 8 years ago, in the spring of 1918. A few months before the war ended, in a ceremony her mother planned almost entirely without her, because that was simply how it was done in the family she came from. She had known Charles for barely a year before the wedding, introduced at a dance by a cousin who thought them well suited, and she has since come to agree with her cousin's judgment more often than not, though she would tell you. If pressed, that agreement is a different thing entirely from the romance she read about as a girl. Charles works downtown, in the bond department of a firm whose name means something on Wall Street and nothing at all 2 blocks in any direction from it, and he leaves the house each morning at 8:15 in a dark suit that Agnes, Helena's lady's maid, has brushed and pressed the night before, and he returns most evenings at 6:30, smelling faintly of cigars and the sharp ink used on stock certificates. He is, by most measures Helena would use to judge such things, a kind husband, generous with his money and mild in his temper. A man who remembers her birthday without being reminded, and who has never once raised his voice at Constance, and Helena is aware, in a clear-eyed way that owes nothing to sentiment, that she was fortunate in the particular husband her family's negotiations happened to produce, whatever she privately thinks about the negotiations themselves. They have one daughter, Constance, 5 years old, who is at this hour still asleep in the nursery 2 floors up, under the care of a nurse named Bridget, who has been with the family since Constance was an infant, and who Helena privately suspects understands the child better than she herself does, a suspicion she has never once said aloud to anyone, including Charles. Helena's own mother, Mrs. Prentice, still living, still in the house on Murray Hill, where Helena grew up, belongs to an older world entirely, a woman who wore a corset her whole life without complaint, and who considers her daughter's bobbed hair a small ongoing tragedy she brings up at least once every visit. It was Mrs. Prentice who taught Helena to write a proper letter, to seat a dinner table correctly, to leave a calling card with the correct folded corner. And it is Mrs. Prentice's voice, more than anyone else's, that Helena hears in her own head each morning on the scale, though her mother has never once mentioned a diet in her life, coming of age as she did in a decade when a fuller figure was simply assumed and never discussed at all. Helena loves her mother with the complicated tenderness of a woman who has quietly rejected half of what she was taught while still performing most of it anyway, and she visits her twice a week, on Wednesdays and Sundays, a fixture of the schedule as reliable as the grapefruit. The house itself rises 4 stories above the street, the kitchen and servants' hall below ground level, the dining room and drawing room on the parlour floor just above it, Helena and Charles's bedroom and dressing rooms on the floor above that, and the nursery tucked under the roof where the ceilings slope and the summer heat gathers first. A narrow back stair connects all 4 levels for the staff, who use it constantly, and a wider front stair, carpeted and rarely creaking, exists mainly for the family and their guests, the 2 staircases running parallel through the same house like 2 separate conversations that happen to share a wall. The household runs on a rhythm as fixed as a church calendar. Mrs. Doyle keeps the kitchen. A houseman named Walter manages the door, the silver, and whatever needs carrying. Frank drives the car, a dark blue sedan that sits in a garage 3 blocks away because there is no room for it any closer, and Agnes manages Helena herself, which is to say her hair, her clothes, her jewellery, the small daily architecture of turning a private woman into a presentable one. 5 people earn their living inside these walls, and their wages sit at the very bottom of an arithmetic Helena rarely has occasion to think about directly. Mrs. Doyle, who has run the kitchen for 11 years, earns something in the neighbourhood of $13 a week, plus her room under the eaves and her board. Walter earns close to the same. Agnes, whose hours run the longest of anyone in the house, from before Helena wakes until after she sleeps, earns perhaps 11. Frank a little more, because a man who can also repair an engine commands a slightly better wage than a man who cannot. Bridget, caring for Constance through every waking hour of the child's day, earns among the least of all of them, a fact nobody in the house has ever discussed aloud, though it sits there anyway, in the same house, under the same roof as the rubber girdle that costs more than Bridget earns in a week. It would be easy, from the outside, to describe Helena's life as one of leisure, and in the sense that she does not go to an office or stand behind a counter, that would not be entirely wrong. But leisure is not quite the word for what fills her days, because very little of it is actually spent resting. There are calls to pay and calls to receive, each one governed by rules about timing and duration that Helena absorbed so early in her life she could not tell you where she learnt them. There are committees, a hospital guild, a benefit for a settlement house on the east side that she has never visited but writes a generous check to twice a year. There is correspondence, real correspondence, letters written by hand to women in other cities whose friendship she maintains almost entirely on paper. There are fittings, with a dressmaker who comes to the house rather than the other way around, because women of Helena's position do not go to a dressmaker so much as summon one. And there is the newer discipline, the one that did not exist for her mother's generation in anything like this form. The discipline of the body itself, tracked every morning on a small white scale that sits in the corner of her dressing room like a piece of furniture nobody quite admits to using. The bathroom scale is a fairly recent arrival in a house like this one. 10 years ago, a woman would have judged her figure by the fit of her corset and the opinion of her dressmaker. Now there is a number, cold and specific, waiting for her every morning before she has even had her tea, and Helena, like most women she knows, has developed a complicated relationship with that number that she has never once discussed with anyone, not even her closest friends. Though she suspects, correctly, that every one of them carries the exact same relationship with a scale of her own. Here is a detail that might surprise you, the kind of small human fact that rarely makes it into the photographs. Helena keeps a tin of peppermints in the drawer of her nightstand, the same brand her mother used to keep in her sewing basket when Helena was a girl, and she eats one, sometimes two, in the quiet hour before she falls asleep, alone with the bedroom door closed. She has never mentioned this to Charles. It is not a secret in any dramatic sense. It is simply hers, a small private inch of appetite that belongs to no one's schedule but her own, and she guards it the way another woman might guard a diary. There is a second small secret, and it belongs to the same drawer. Underneath the tin of peppermint sits a paper novel with a lurid cover, a detective story her sister sent from Philadelphia, wrapped inside a hat box so it would not be seen passing through the front hall. Women of Helena's set are meant to read serious novels, or improving ones, and to leave anything with a body on the cover to their maids. Helena reads 3 or 4 pages of hers most nights before the peppermint and the sleep that follows it, never quite admitting to Dorothy or Cornelia that she has finished the thing twice already. And she keeps a second copy of a more respectable novel on the shelf downstairs for anyone who happens to ask what she is reading this month. Today is, by Helena's own private accounting, a fairly ordinary day, which is exactly why it is worth spending with her. There is no ball tonight, no wedding, nothing that will end up described in the society pages tomorrow morning. There is only the ordinary architecture of a fashionable woman's week, the way in, the toilet, a luncheon with 2 friends at a tea room on East 53rd Street, a fitting in the early afternoon, calls to pay before 4 o'clock, and in the evening, a dinner party at the home of a couple named the Fairleys. 8 courses, 12 guests, ending sometime after 11. Her schedule lives in a small leather notebook that sits on the writing desk in her sitting room, each day's obligations noted in her own hand in blue ink. And if you opened it to today's page, you would find, alongside the appointments, a single word written in the corner that she writes most mornings without quite thinking about it. Careful. Just that. A reminder to herself, in her own handwriting, about the day ahead, and about the version of herself she intends to bring into every room she enters before the day is through. There is one thing Helena thinks about more than she would ever admit, and it concerns Constance, still 5 years old, still years away from any of this. Helena has already begun to notice, in small, unguarded moments, the exact age at which a girl in her circle typically learns to look at her own reflection with something other than plain, uncomplicated pleasure. And she has caught herself wondering, more than once, whether Constance's turn is already somewhere down the road waiting for her, patient and inevitable as a scheduled appointment. She has not decided what she will do when that day comes, whether to shield her daughter from all of it or simply prepare her the way her own mother tried, imperfectly, to prepare Helena. It is not a thought she has settled, and she suspects, without quite admitting it to herself, that it may never fully settle at all. It is now a little past 7 in the morning. Somewhere above the nursery, a bird has started up in the plane tree outside the window. Somewhere below, in the kitchen, Mrs. Doyle has finished with the grapefruit. And somewhere in between, in a bedroom with the curtains still drawn against the early light, Helena Whitcomb is opening her eyes. Let us watch her begin the day. It is 7:15, and Helena Whitcomb is awake before Agnes even knocks, lying still for a moment beneath a good deal more blanket than the September morning strictly requires, listening to the pipes tick somewhere behind the wall as the radiators begin their slow work of warming the house. The first thing she does, before she has even reached for her wrapper, is walk to the corner of the dressing room where the scale waits. It is a simple thing to look at, white enamel, a small round dial under glass, the sort of object a decade ago would have seemed as out of place in a lady's dressing room as a piece of factory equipment. Now it is as ordinary a fixture as the mirror beside it. She steps onto it in her bare feet, in her nightgown, before breakfast, before water, before anything at all that might weigh in her favor or against it, because she has learned, the way most women in her circle have learned, that the number only means something if it is caught at the same hour, under the same conditions, every single day. The dial settles. She looks down. There is no expression on her face that Agnes, coming in a moment later with the washing water, would be able to read one way or the other. And that, too, is a kind of skill. The ability to receive whatever the scale has told you without letting your face announce the verdict to the rest of the house. Now, here is where most people get this wrong. When they picture a woman like Helena in 1926, the popular idea of the flapper is a creature of pure abandon, dancing until dawn, careless about consequence, gloriously indifferent to rules. And there was some of that, certainly, in certain rooms, on certain nights. But the woman standing on that scale at 7:15 in the morning is not indifferent to anything. She is, if anything, one of the most disciplined people in her own household. More disciplined than Walter with the silver, more disciplined than Frank with the motor car's maintenance schedule. The freedom this era is famous for granting women came bundled, almost immediately, with a new and exacting set of demands on exactly the same women, and nobody wrote those demands down anywhere, which somehow made them harder to argue with, not easier. Agnes helps her into her underthings first, and this is its own small production. There is a brassiere designed expressly to flatten rather than lift, a boyish contradiction of a garment that undoes, on purpose, the entire architecture undergarments used to exist to build. Over it goes a girdle of light rubber and elastic, snug through the hip, because even a slender woman needs help producing the perfectly tubular line the new dresses expect, and Helena stands, with her arms slightly raised, while Agnes works the fastenings, the two of them talking about nothing much, whether Constance's cough from Tuesday has fully cleared, whether the milk delivery has been running late again. It is worth noticing, while Agnes works, that Agnes herself is a slim young woman, slimmer than Helena if anyone were counting, though nobody in this house would ever describe her figure as fashionable. Because fashion, as this decade understands it, is something that happens to women who are looked at, and a lady's maid moves through her employer's rooms in a kind of practiced invisibility that spares her most of the scrutiny Helena endures every hour of her own day. Agnes eats what she is served in the servants' hall, plainly and without ceremony, and has never once owned a rubber girdle or stood on a bathroom scale in her life. The pressure Helena carries does not simply flow downhill through the household. It settles, unevenly, on the women whose bodies are meant to be seen, and passes almost entirely over the women whose work is meant to go unnoticed. Hair comes next, And here Helena has already made her peace with a decision most women her mother's age still consider faintly scandalous. She bobbed it 2 years ago, cutting away in one appointment what her mother had spent a lifetime growing, and Agnes now spends 10 minutes each morning setting the Marcel wave with a heated iron. The smell of slightly singed hair oil filling the small room. A smell Helena has come to find almost comforting. The smell of a day being assembled around her one decision at a time. Last comes the face, a light dusting of rice powder pressed on with a small chamois puff. A touch of rouge worked carefully into the cheekbone rather than the whole cheek, since a fashionable face this year wants colour in one precise place rather than a general glow, and a dark pencil for the brows, which Helena has thinned since her wedding day to suit a look her mother still calls, without much affection, the surprised expression. The whole process takes perhaps 10 minutes, and it produces, when it is finished, a face that looks entirely natural, unpainted, effortless, which is of course the entire point of having spent 10 careful minutes achieving it. By 8 o'clock she is downstairs, seated at the small table in the breakfast room where Mrs. Doyle's tray is waiting exactly as it waits every morning. Half a grapefruit, its sections loosened with a serrated spoon so that eating it becomes a series of small, unhurried extractions rather than a single act of biting into fruit. A cup of black tea, or on some mornings coffee, always without cream, always without sugar. A single piece of toast, dry, cut into triangles, more a gesture toward breakfast than an actual meal. Helena eats slowly, the way she has trained herself to eat everything, because a meal stretched over 20 unhurried minutes feels, psychologically, like considerably more food than the same portion eaten in 5. While she waits, Helena glances at her own section of the folded newspaper, the pages given over to society and to the smaller items considered suitable for a lady's attention, and finds a short piece about a women's political league meeting downtown, debating some fine point of a bill in Albany that Helena only half understands. She reads it twice, feeling something she rarely names directly, a kind of restless curiosity about a room she has never sat in and a conversation she has never joined, before folding the paper closed and setting it aside, because there is nowhere in the day ahead where that curiosity has anywhere useful to go. Charles comes down at 8:20, dressed, reading yesterday's closing prices off a folded paper, and kisses the top of her head on his way past rather than sitting down. Because he eats a full breakfast, eggs and bacon and toast with butter, standing at the sideboard the way he has for years, a habit that has never once drawn comment from anyone in the house, though it sits, silently, in direct contrast to what is on his wife's plate every single morning. Neither of them has ever discussed this difference out loud. It simply is the shape their marriage has taken, one plate heavy, one plate light, and both of them consider it entirely unremarkable. There is more to understand here about the psychology of the dress itself, because the dress is really where all of this converges. After breakfast, Agnes brings in 3 options for the day, laid over her arm, and Helena chooses the pale blue crêpe de chine for the luncheon, a dress that hangs from 2 thin straps at the shoulder and falls in a straight, unbroken line to just below the knee. No waist to speak of, no seam doing any work to disguise anything at all. 10 years ago, a dress like this would have been considered nearly indecent for daytime, not because it showed skin, it shows almost none, but because it showed shape, the plain, undisguised report of whatever body happened to be standing underneath the fabric. Standing in front of the long mirror while Agnes fastens the last hook, Helena studies the line of her own hip the way a merchant studies a ledger, not with vanity exactly, something colder and more practical than vanity, an assessment of whether today's version of her body will pass the day's inspection without incident. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told, the sheer mental labor of it. The fact that a woman like Helena might spend some portion of nearly every waking hour running a kind of quiet audit on her own body. An audit nobody asked her to perform out loud, and everybody expected her to perform anyway. It happens quickly, this kind of checking. No more than a few seconds in front of any mirror she passes, but it happens constantly, dozens of times across a single day, in shop windows and hallway glass and the polished brass of the front door, a running tally kept so automatically by now that Helena rarely notices she is keeping it at all. At 9:30, the telephone rings in the front hall, and Walter answers it before bringing the receiver through to Helena on its long cord. It is her friend Dorothy Ames confirming their luncheon plans for 12:30 at the tea room on East 53rd Street, and the two of them talk for a few minutes about nothing of consequence. A hat Dorothy has just bought, a dinner party from the previous week, before Dorothy mentions, almost as an aside, that she has started the grapefruit and vinegar regimen a doctor's wife recommended to her. Half a grapefruit and a spoonful of cider vinegar in warm water before each meal, and that she has lost, she believes, nearly 4 pounds already. Helena says she has heard of it too, and does not mention that she has, in fact, already been doing something close to it herself for the better part of a month. Because there is an etiquette to these conversations as precise as any etiquette involving calling cards, and admitting too readily to one's own methods is considered, faintly, a kind of vanity. Walter brings in the Morning Post on a small silver salver a few minutes before 10, 3 envelopes and a folded card. One envelope holds a bill from the dressmaker, which Helena sets aside for Charles's attention without opening it further than the first line. Another holds an invitation, heavy creamstock, engraved, to a charity ball at the end of October that half the women she knows will attend, and the other half will spend weeks pretending not to mind having missed. The folded card is simpler, from Cornelia, a note about a new masseuse she has found on the east side of the park, who specializes, the card says, in a firm, rolling treatment said to break down what the advertisements call stubborn tissue, and Helena reads it twice before setting it with the rest of the morning's small business, neither committing to an appointment, nor quite dismissing the idea either. The morning continues in its small increments. Correspondence to answer at the writing desk, 3 letters, one to her sister in Philadelphia, one to the Hospital Guild confirming her attendance at Thursday's meeting, one simply a note of thanks to a hostess from the weekend before. Her hand moves steadily across the paper in the same round, careful script her governess drilled into her as a girl, and she blots each page before folding it, because a smudged letter, in her mother's old phrase, tells a stranger more about a woman than she ever intended to say. A brief visit from the dressmaker's assistant with a swatch of new silk for approval. A quarter of an hour spent with Constance before Bridget takes her out for her morning walk in the park, Helena kneeling on the nursery floor in her good dress to retie a ribbon in her daughter's hair. One of the only unguarded stretches in the entire morning. The one part of the day where nobody, including Helena herself, is keeping score of anything at all. By 11:30 she is dressing to go out, Agnes fixing a small cloche hat at precisely the angle fashion currently demands, and Frank is bringing the car around from 3 blocks away, the engine idling at the curb by the time Helena reaches the front steps. Frank touches his cap and holds the door, and the two of them exchange a few words about nothing more consequential than the morning traffic on the avenue, the small ordinary courtesy that passes between them most days and rarely amounts to more than that. Helena checks her reflection once more in the hall mirror by the door, the pale blue dress catching the light from the transom window above, and for just a moment, before she reaches for her gloves, she allows herself something close to satisfaction. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter and more provisional than happiness. The feeling of having, so far, gotten the morning right. It is 11:45. The house behind her is already rearranging itself around her absence, Walter answering the door for a delivery, Mrs. Doyle beginning the preparations for the family's own dinner later that evening, Bridget somewhere in the park with Constance feeding pigeons by the fountain. Helena steps out onto the stoop, down toward the waiting car, and the morning, such as it was, closes itself behind her. Let us stop here for a moment. Before we follow Helena into her afternoon, and talk about what all of this actually cost. Because the economics of staying slim in 1926 turn out to be almost as interesting as the diets themselves. And they touch nearly everything we have watched so far this morning. Start with the scale itself. That white enamel object in the corner of Helena's dressing room. Home bathroom scales are a fairly new product in households like hers, only really becoming common furniture in the better sort of American bathroom over the past 5 or 6 years. A good one, from a maker like Fairbanks or a competing firm, runs somewhere around $8 to $10, which does not sound like much until you set it beside a shopgirl's weekly wage of $15 or $16, at which point a bathroom scale becomes something closer to 2/3 of a week's income, purchased for the sole purpose of measuring an absence, the absence of whatever weight one is actively trying not to carry. The rubber-reducing garments are a stranger economy still. Advertisements for them run regularly in the women's magazines Helena and her friends read, promising that a garment of specially treated rubber, worn snug against the skin under one's ordinary clothes, will induce a gentle, continuous perspiration throughout the day that melts away unwanted inches without any deliberate effort beyond simply getting dressed in the morning. A good reducing girdle of this kind might cost anywhere from $3 to $6, considerably more than an ordinary girdle of cotton and elastic, and the markup, when you think about it plainly, is being paid for a promise rather than a proven result. A promise that a woman's own sweat, trapped against her skin for 8 or 10 hours at a stretch, is doing something more useful than simply making her uncomfortable. Then there is Fleischmann's yeast, whose advertising campaign through these years is one of the more remarkable pieces of commercial theatre the era produced. The company sells small cakes of compressed yeast, originally intended for baking, and has begun marketing them directly to women as a food to be eaten on its own. 3 cakes a day, dissolved in water or simply chewed, for what the advertisements describe as clearer skin, better digestion, and a general lightening of the whole system. A cake costs only a few cents. The cleverness of the campaign is that it asks almost nothing of a woman's budget, while asking a great deal of her daily routine, 3 separate small rituals worked into a day already crowded with rituals. Each one a fresh, cheap opportunity to feel as though she is doing something active about her own body between meals rather than simply enduring the meals themselves. Knox unflavored gelatin runs along a similar track, a box costing around 10 cents, marketed heavily to women as the foundation for the molded salads that have become a fixture of fashionable luncheons, savory gelatin set around shredded cabbage or a clear jellied consomme, presented in individual molds that look, frankly, more like a small science demonstration than a meal, and eaten in small jiggling spoonfuls that feel, to the woman eating them, considerably more substantial on the plate than they turn out to be in the stomach an hour later. A tea room lunch built around one of these molded salads, a cup of clear soup, and black coffee might run somewhere between 50 cents and $1 at one of the better establishments near Fifth Avenue. A summer shop girl on her lunch hour would think twice about spending an entire meal's budget on, and a woman like Helena would not think about at all. Behind all of it sits an industry that is only just beginning to understand how much money there is to be made from a woman's dissatisfaction with her own body. The women's magazines Helena and her friends read carry more advertising for reducing AIDS in a single issue than they did 5 years earlier. Full pages given over to girdles and tonics and tablets, and the magazines themselves earn a growing share of their revenue from exactly this kind of advertisement, which gives them a quiet, unspoken incentive to keep publishing articles that remind their readers, gently and repeatedly, that there is always a little more slimming left to be done. Nobody at Helena's breakfast table would ever describe it this way, but the machinery selling her the grapefruit diet and the machinery selling her the magazine that praised the grapefruit diet are, increasingly, the very same machinery, feeding each other in a loop that will only grow larger and more sophisticated in the decades to come. And there is the cigarette, which by the back half of this decade has entered the conversation too, as certain tobacco companies begin marketing smoking directly at women as an appetite suppressant. a slim cigarette held in a gloved hand between courses, standing in, quite literally, for the slice of cake a woman might once have reached for instead. A pack cost somewhere around 15 cents, considerably cheaper than the pastry it is meant to replace, which makes it, from a certain cold angle, one of the more affordable weight management strategies the era has to offer, a fact that would only become a source of real alarm to anyone many decades later, once the rest of what a cigarette actually does to a body was better understood. There is also the dressmaker herself, sitting above all of this the way a general contractor sits above the tradesman under him. A single afternoon dress from a shop like Mrs. Lindqvist's, cut and fitted and finished by hand, runs somewhere between $30 and $60 depending on the silk and the amount of beading involved, which is to say more than Mrs. Doyle earns in a month of running Helena's own kitchen, and more than 4 months of what Bridget is paid to spend every waking hour with Constance. Helena will own perhaps a dozen such dresses by the time the season turns, along with several evening gowns that cost considerably more, and none of that arithmetic ever quite occurs to her while she is standing on the fitting platform, because the money involved belongs to an entirely different room of her mind than the one occupied by Agnes's wages or Frank's. A separation that the household maintains as carefully as it maintains any other point of etiquette. For Helena, none of these individual costs amount to very much against a household budget that also includes a full domestic staff, a dressmaker on retainer, and a motor car with its own driver. But that is the point worth sitting with. The reducing regimen is not, primarily, an economic burden for a woman in her position. It is something closer to a badge, a visible sign that she belongs to a class of women who can afford to eat lightly by choice rather than by necessity, in a city where 2 blocks in the wrong direction, women are going hungry for reasons that have nothing to do with fashion at all. The half grapefruit on Helena's tray each morning is, in its own quiet way, a small performance of leisure, proof that she does not need the heartier breakfast a working body requires, because her body is not, in any sense the era recognized, required to work. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely once you notice it. The slender, fashionable body of 1926 is not simply an aesthetic preference. It is a class signal, dressed up as a beauty standard, and the women pursuing it most intently tend to be exactly the women who could, if they wished, eat as heartily as anyone in the city. They simply choose not to, and that choice, repeated every single morning on a small white scale, is doing quiet social work that has almost nothing to do with vanity in the way we tend to use that word today. Let us return, now, to Helena, who by this point in the afternoon has arrived at the tea room on East 53rd Street, where Dorothy Ames is already seated at their usual table by the window. Frank drives her the short distance uptown, though on a clear afternoon like this one she sometimes asks him to let her out a block early so she can walk the rest of the way. Past the milliner's window with its autumn hats already displayed on velvet stands, past a newsstand where a boy is arranging the afternoon edition, past a beggar seated against the wall of the bank on the corner, whom Helena passes with her eyes forward and a coin already in her glove, dropped without breaking stride, a small transaction she has performed the same way for years without ever once discussing it with anyone. It is 1:45, and the tea room on East 53rd Street has the hush of a room designed entirely around the comfort of women who have nowhere urgent to be. Potted palms stand between the tables. A pianist plays something unobtrusive near the back, more suggestion of music than music itself. The tables are small, set close together, but somehow private anyway, each one occupied by 2 or 3 women in cloche hats and dropped waist dresses, leaning in over cups and small plates. The whole room humming with conversation pitched just low enough that no single sentence carries further than its own table. Dorothy Ames is already seated when Helena arrives, and a moment later they are joined by a third friend, Cornelia Vance, whose husband works in shipping and whose hats, Helena has noticed more than once, are always a season ahead of everyone else's. The three of them settle in with the easy, practiced warmth of women who have been having this same lunch, in one form or another, for the better part of a decade. 2 tables over, a family Helena does not recognize. Newer money by the look of the wife's dress. A shade too bright and a season too eager is finishing an actual luncheon, sandwiches and a shared plate of small cakes, and Dorothy notes it with a small lift of one eyebrow that says everything she intends to say on the subject without a single word actually being spoken. It is not kindness, exactly, this quiet cataloguing of who has learned the unwritten rules and who has not. But it is not quite cruelty either. It is simply how a room like this one keeps score, constantly, of everyone inside it. The menu at a tea room like this one is built almost entirely around the assumption that the women eating there are managing their weight, whether or not any of them would ever say so plainly. Dorothy orders the jellied consomme, a clear beef broth set with gelatin into something closer to a savory dessert than a soup, served cool in a small glass cup. Cornelia orders the chicken salad ring, a mound of diced chicken and celery suspended inside a wall of gelatin molded in a ring pan, turned out onto a bed of shredded lettuce so that the whole thing trembles slightly when the plate is set down, catching the light from the window in a way that makes it look, for a moment, almost like a piece of jewelry rather than food. Helena orders the same, along with black coffee, and none of them so much as glances at the small dessert menu tucked at the back of the card. There is something worth noticing in the texture of the meal itself, because it is unlike almost anything eaten at the start of this century. The gelatin holds its shape and then gives way all at once between the teeth, cool and faintly rubbery, releasing whatever it has been holding suspended inside it, cabbage or chicken or a thin curl of pimento, in small bursts rather than a single continuous bite. It is a strange way to eat, if you stop and think about it, a meal designed as much to be looked at and photographed for a magazine spread as to be actually consumed, and the three women eat it with small, unhurried bites. The way Helena eats her grapefruit each morning, stretching a modest portion out across a full half-hour of conversation. The talk moves, as it usually does, through a season's worth of small news before it settles anywhere near the subject that all three of them are, in their own private ways, thinking about nearly constantly. Cornelia mentions a friend of hers uptown who has started what she calls the pineapple regimen. A few slices of fresh pineapple and a small lamb chop for lunch. Nothing else. A combination some doctor connected to one of the better hotels has apparently begun recommending to his more fashionable patients. Dorothy says she has heard the same doctor also swears by black coffee and dry toast for breakfast, which makes Helena smile slightly into her own cup, since that has been her breakfast, more or less unchanged, for the better part of a year now, long before any doctor's name was attached to it. Here is where most people get this wrong when they imagine what a fashionable lunch looked like in this era. The popular picture is one of abandon, champagne glasses and jazz records, and a general glorious indifference to consequence. The actual lunch, the one Helena and Dorothy and Cornelia are having right now, is a quiet, careful, almost mathematical exercise, three women comparing notes on hunger management the way their husbands might compare notes on the bond market 2 blocks away. With the same seriousness, the same attention to method, the same faint, unspoken competitiveness about whose approach is producing the best results. Nobody at the table says the word diet more than once or twice. It is considered slightly vulgar to dwell on it too openly, the way discussing money too directly is considered vulgar in the same circles. Instead, the conversation moves in a kind of code, regimen, discipline, being careful, being sensible, words that mean exactly what diet means without ever quite saying it, and all three women understand each phrase perfectly, the way any fluent speaker understands a native idiom that would baffle an outsider entirely. Before they part ways, the three of them stop in at a department store 2 doors down, drawn by a window display of the season's new foundation garments arranged on faceless mannequins, and they spend a few minutes at the counter where a shop girl no older than 20, Her own figure, carefully corseted under a plain grey uniform dress, shows them the newest reducing girdle, lighter than last year's model, she promises, with a new panel said to control the hip more comfortably than the rubber alone. The girl recites the features with the practiced patience of someone who has given this exact speech a dozen times already today, to women who could each buy out her entire counter without noticing the expense, and Cornelia asks a few questions and buys nothing. Dorothy buys a size she has not yet earned and intends to grow into through effort, and Helena simply admires the stitching before the three of them move on, the shopgirl already turning to the next customer before the door has fully closed behind them. By 1:30, lunch is finished, and the three of them part ways on the sidewalk outside, Cornelia off to a fitting of her own, Dorothy home to relieve her children's governess for the afternoon, Helena walking 2 blocks to the dressmaker's shop where Mrs. Lindqvist, a Swedish woman with pins permanently tucked into the cuff of her sleeve, is waiting for her. Mrs. Lindqvist came to New York from Stockholm 18 years ago with a trunk of sewing tools and a letter of introduction to a shop on 6th Avenue that no longer exists, and she has built her own small business since then almost entirely on word passed between women exactly like Helena. One satisfied client mentioning her name to another over tea. She has watched the silhouette turn over twice in her career now, from the full Edwardian skirt to the war years narrower cut to whatever this is, and she has her own opinions about which shape flattered a woman's actual body best. Opinions she keeps almost entirely to herself. Because a dressmaker who criticizes the fashion is a dressmaker who soon has no clients left to dress. The fitting is its own kind of afternoon labor. Helena stands on a small raised platform in front of 3 mirrors while Mrs. Lindqvist works around her, pinning a 1/2 inch out of the waist here, letting a 1/2 inch back out at the hip there, both of them studying the fall of the silk with the seriousness of engineers reviewing a bridge design. The dress is meant for a dinner at the Fairlays next week, pale gold with a dropped waist and a hem that moves when Helena moves. And Mrs. Lindqvist keeps stepping back to check the line of it from across the room, because the entire point of a dress like this one is how it behaves in motion, whether it clings or floats, whether it announces the shape underneath it too plainly or just plainly enough. The pale gold silk pools and slides under Mrs. Lindqvist's hands, cool and slightly slippery to the touch, the kind of fabric that shows every pin mark and every uneven seam under the fitting room's bright northern light, and the small room smells faintly of the beeswax Mrs. Lindqvist rubs into her thread and the chalk she uses to mark a hem before she cuts it. Standing still on the platform for the better part of 40 minutes, arms slightly raised, Helena has time to think in a way the rest of her morning did not really allow, and what she finds herself thinking about, more than the dress, is the girdle underneath it, and the faint mark it leaves along her hip by the end of most days, a mark Agnes has stopped commenting on, because it is simply, by now, a fact of Helena's body, the same way a wedding ring leaves its own small mark. There is more to understand about this than a single fitting can hold, and we will spend real time with it later tonight when the day's garments finally come off. For now, Mrs. Lindqvist finishes her pinning, and Helena steps down carefully, still bristling with pins along one seam, to change back into her own clothes. The early afternoon is given over to calls, the ritual visiting that still governs a good portion of how women in Helena's circle maintain their friendships and their standing at once. She leaves cards at 2 houses where the ladies are not receiving, a small folded corner indicating she called in person rather than simply sending a servant. And she sits for 20 minutes at a 3rd house, a Mrs. Pemberton, discussing the upcoming hospital guild meeting over tea Helena barely touches, the cup mostly a prop to hold while the conversation runs its course. Mrs. Pemberton's drawing room smells of chrysanthemums and furniture polish, and Mrs. Pemberton herself, considerably older than Helena, older even than Helena's own mother, presides over the visit with the settled confidence of a woman who has stopped counting calories decades ago and has never once regretted it. She offers a plate of small sandwiches that Helena declines with a smile and a mention of the luncheon she has just come from, and Mrs. Pemberton nods without pressing the matter, though there is something in her expression, brief and unreadable, that might be sympathy, or might simply be the private amusement of a woman watching a fashion she has already outlived play itself out again in someone else's generation. Before Helena leaves, Mrs. Pemberton asks after Constance by name, and after Helena's mother too, and the two of them spend a final few minutes on family rather than committees, a small warm patch in an otherwise formal call, before Helena rises, thanks her hostess, and steps back out into the cooling afternoon. Before going up, Helena stops in the kitchen for a few minutes, as she does most afternoons, to confirm the evening's arrangements with Mrs. Doyle, since the family will be out tonight but Constance and the staff will not. Mrs. Doyle has planned a proper supper for the nursery and the servants' hall both. Roast chicken, potatoes, a suet pudding to follow, hearty food that nobody in this kitchen would dream of serving upstairs to Helena herself on an ordinary evening. And Helena approves the menu with a nod and a brief word of thanks, feeling, as she often does standing in this doorway, a small flicker of something between envy and relief at the plain, uncomplicated abundance of what her own daughter will eat tonight without a second thought. By 3:30, she is home again, and the house has the quiet of mid-afternoon. Constance down for her rest, the staff occupied with their own quieter work, the whole day suspended for a moment between its public performance and whatever comes next. Helena goes up to her room, takes off her hat, and sits for a few minutes at the window without doing anything at all, watching the light move across the wall opposite, the one stretch of the afternoon that belongs entirely to her and to nobody's schedule but her own. It will not last long. There is a dinner tonight, at the Fairleighs, and the evening ahead has its own architecture already assembled and waiting. The redness along Helena's hip is a small detail, but small details like that one tend to open a door into something larger, and it is worth walking through that door for a moment before we follow her into the evening, because the health question sitting underneath all of this was very much alive in 1926, argued over in exactly the kind of rooms Helena herself would never have set foot in. One of the tools lending all of this its air of scientific respectability is a set of height and weight tables that a large insurance company has been refining and publishing for over a decade now, drawn from the records of its own policyholders and presented as an objective, almost clinical standard for what a woman of a given height ought to weigh. Helena has seen a version of this table reprinted in a magazine and has measured herself against it more than once, the way she might check a hem length against a ruler without ever quite stopping to ask who those policyholders were, or whether a table built from one narrow slice of insured customers had any real business setting the standard for every woman who read the magazine. Doctors of the period were not unanimous about any of this, which is itself worth knowing. A certain kind of society physician, the sort attached to a fashionable hotel or a wealthy private practice, built a comfortable business recommending exactly the regimens Helena and her friends traded over lunch: the grapefruit, the pineapple and lamb chop, the black coffee taken instead of a heartier breakfast, and these physicians were happy enough to lend their professional authority to what was, underneath the medical language, mostly fashion advice dressed in a white coat. But there was another kind of doctor entirely, writing in medical journals and increasingly in the more serious women's magazines, sounding a genuine alarm about what they were beginning to call, in print, a reducing mania. These physicians documented cases of young women fainting at dances and dinner parties, not from the emotional overwhelm the previous generation might have assumed, but from simple, straightforward hunger, bodies running for days at a time on grapefruit and dry toast and black coffee, asked to stand and dance and carry on animated conversation on considerably fewer calories than they required. There is more to understand here than a single fainting spell suggests. This was common enough in certain circles that a woman going pale and unsteady partway through an evening was met with a specific, practiced response, a chair brought quickly. Smelling salts produced from someone's evening bag, the whole incident absorbed into the evening with a kind of weary familiarity that suggests it happened more often than anyone wanted to say plainly. A hospital physician quoted in one of these articles put the problem more bluntly than most of his colleagues cared to, observing that he had treated more healthy young women for plain malnutrition in the past 2 years than in the previous decade combined, and that every one of them, without exception, had come to him not from poverty but from a fashion magazine. The rubber-reducing girdle drew its own share of medical concern too. And here the story carries a genuine irony worth sitting with, one of those patterns that connects an era to the one just before it in a way most people never notice. A generation earlier, in the final years of the previous century, health reformers had campaigned loudly against the tightly laced corset, arguing, correctly, that it compressed organs, restricted breathing, and did real physical damage to women who wore it laced as fashion demanded. Those reformers largely won that argument. The rigid, heavily boned corset had truly fallen out of fashion by the 1920s, replaced by softer, more flexible undergarments, and an entire generation of women grew up believing they had been freed from exactly this kind of bodily constraint. And yet here is Helena, a full generation later, in a garment built from rubber rather than whalebone, designed specifically to trap heat and induce sweating for hours at a stretch, leaving its own mark on her skin by the end of most days, worn in pursuit of an ideal every bit as demanding as the one her mother's corset once enforced. The garment changed. The underlying demand that a woman's body answer to a standard set somewhere outside herself did not change nearly as much as anyone at the time believed it had. This is one of the patterns worth carrying with you tonight, because we will return to it later, once we have seen the whole of Helena's day. The rubber girdle was hardly the only mechanical solution on offer. Certain of the better hotels and salons in the city had begun installing electric vibrating belts, a wide strap of canvas and metal buckled around the hips and set humming by a small motor. The theory being that the vibration itself, applied faithfully for 20 minutes at a time, would loosen and dissolve unwanted flesh the way a washboard loosens dirt from a shirt collar. A session cost anywhere from $2 to $5, and women like Cornelia's masseuse recommending friends booked them the way a modern woman might book any other weekly appointment, without much question about whether the machine did anything at all beyond producing a pleasant, faintly ridiculous hum and a receipt. The Turkish bathhouses uptown offered a gentler version of the same promise, an hour of steam and sweat said to draw impurities and excess weight out through the pores, and it is worth saying plainly that neither the belt nor the bath accomplished anything of lasting substance, though both were sold and bought in perfectly good faith by people who wanted very much to believe that effort of some visible kind was being expended on their behalf. A darker corner of this same market deserves an honest mention too, because it existed, and pretending otherwise would not serve the truth of the story. Certain patent tablets sold through the back pages of women's magazines, marketed under names that suggested nothing more alarming than a gentle tonic, in fact, worked as laxatives, sometimes strong ones, and a number of women in Helena's circle and circles like it took them regularly in pursuit of the same flattened appearance the grapefruit and the girdle were meant to produce. The physicians sounding the alarm about reducing mania worried about this practice more than almost any other, and rightly so, though the tablets remained easy enough to purchase and easy enough to keep quiet about. Tucked into the same drawer as a woman's other private methods, unmentioned at the tea-room table the way the peppermint tin in Helena's own nightstand goes unmentioned. There was a gentler option too, one that a handful of physicians actually approved of, and that was exercise. Though the exercise fashionable women were encouraged toward in 1926 looked nothing like the vigorous outdoor activity their granddaughters would one day take for granted. Reducing gymnasium classes had begun appearing in a few of the better hotels and ladies' clubs. Small groups of women in loose bloomers performing slow, repetitive stretching and bending exercises under the direction of an instructor with a stopwatch, the whole session lasting perhaps 40 minutes and drawing far more on discipline than on any real exertion. Dorothy attends one such class twice a week and has tried, without much success, to persuade Helena to join her, arguing that it feels considerably more dignified than a rubber girdle and considerably less strange than an electric belt. Though Helena has so far preferred her own quieter methods to a room full of women counting bends aloud together under the flat white glare of the gymnasium's electric lights. The social codes governing all of this ran just as deep as the medical debate. Maybe deeper, because they operated in every room Helena entered without ever needing to be written down anywhere. A woman was expected to maintain an appearance of effortlessness about her figure, to seem naturally slender rather than laboriously slender, and there was a real penalty, social rather than medical, for seeming to try too visibly. To be caught discussing one's diet too eagerly, or eating too enthusiastically at a public luncheon, or, worse, appearing hungry, was its own small social failure, evidence that the whole performance required more effort than a truly elegant woman ought to need. Helena's careful, unhurried way of eating her half grapefruit each morning is not simply a habit of pacing. It is a small daily rehearsal in looking as though none of this costs her anything at all. Religion touched this world too, if lightly, mostly through a broader cultural current running underneath the whole decade, a growing faith in the idea that the body could be governed by the will, the way a household budget could be governed by discipline. That self-control itself was a kind of virtue with almost moral weight to it. A woman who mastered her own appetite was understood, in certain circles, to be demonstrating something close to character, the same vocabulary her grandmother's generation might have applied to temperance or thrift, now redirected entirely toward the dinner plate. A newer strain of popular thought, preached in small parlor meetings and printed in slim, hopeful pamphlets, went further still, holding that the mind alone could shape the body if a woman simply believed hard enough in the shape she wanted. A philosophy that asked no less discipline than the grapefruit regimen and offered, in exchange, the comforting idea that hunger itself was largely a failure of imagination. The etiquette manuals of the day, the sort every young woman of Helena's set received as a wedding gift alongside the silver, addressed the whole subject only obliquely, advising that a lady never discuss her weight, her diet, or her health at table, and that any question about her appetite be met with a light remark and a change of subject. The rule was framed as a matter of good taste, and in a narrow sense it was. But it also served, conveniently, to keep the entire arrangement invisible, a set of demanding private practices that etiquette itself insisted must never be spoken about in public. Among themselves, women like Helena knew the doctor's warnings perfectly well and treated them the way people have always treated warnings that arrive from a comfortable distance, with a nod, a moment of genuine concern, and very little actual change in behavior. Dorothy will mention, offhand, that her own physician cautioned her against the vinegar drink just last month, before ordering it again at the very next luncheon without any sense of contradiction, because the warning belonged to the world of doctors and journals, and the vinegar drink belonged to the world she actually had to live in every day. And the two worlds, however much they should have touched, rarely did. None of this is a story with a villain in it, and it is worth saying that plainly before we move on. The physicians who worried about fainting spells were not wrong, and neither were they in a position to unwind an entire fashionable culture on their own. The women following these regimens were not foolish or vain in any simple sense. They were responding, with real intelligence and real discipline, to a set of expectations that had arrived from somewhere far larger than any one dinner table, expectations built out of new fashion, new photography, new advertising, and a new economy of visibility that none of them had asked for, and all of them were, in one way or another, required to answer. Let us return now to Helena's evening, because the Fairleys' dinner party is only a few hours away, and there is a very particular kind of endurance waiting for her there. By 7 o'clock, the pale gold dress from that afternoon's fitting has made its way from Mrs. Lindquist's shop to Helena's own closet, delivered by a boy on a bicycle while she rested. The seams finished, the pins gone, ready for the evening ahead. Agnes helps her into it the way she helped her into everything else today, though this dressing takes longer, because an evening dress of this kind asks more of the whole assembly underneath it: a fresh girdle, a slip cut to prevent the silk from clinging in any unflattering direction, stockings checked twice for runs by the light of the dressing table lamp. Charles is ready before she is, standing in the hallway in his evening clothes, watching his wife's reflection in the mirror the way he has watched it for 8 years now, with a kind of proprietary fondness that Helena has never entirely decided how she feels about. He tells her she looks well. She thanks him and continues fixing an earring, because there is still the matter of getting the earring exactly right, and a compliment, however kindly meant, does not actually finish the job. The short drive over happens just as the light is going, the sky over the park turning a deep, bruised blue behind the rooftops. Street lamps flickering on one by one down the block as the city hands itself over from one shift to the next. The newsboys and delivery boys of the daytime giving way to a quieter evening population of doormen and chauffeurs, and the occasional couple already dressed for dinner, hurrying along the sidewalk with their heads bent against the cooling air. Charles hums something under his breath, a tune from a show they saw together the previous winter, and Helena watches the lit windows slide past, other people's dinners already underway behind other people's curtains. The Fairleys live 4 blocks over, in a house slightly grander than the Whitcombs' own, and by the time Frank has driven them there and back to their own garage, the evening has properly begun. A houseman taking coats in the front hall, a low buzz of conversation already rising from the drawing room, where the first arrivals are gathered with drinks nobody discusses openly as cocktails, in deference to the law that technically forbids them. Dinner is 8 courses, which was not an unusual number for a dinner of this kind in this circle, though it sounds almost absurd said plainly out loud a century later. Clear soup, the colour of weak tea, arrives first, faintly perfumed with sherry. A small fish course follows, a delicate filet under a pale cream sauce, the smell of butter and lemon rising off the plate as it is set down. A sorbet clears the palate between courses, sharp and cold, gone in 3 bites. Squab with vegetables comes next, the small dark bird glistening under its own reduced sauce. A salad course, naturally built around a gelatin mould, this one studded with diced pear and set in individual glass cups, the pear suspended mid-fall like something caught in ice. A cheese course, sharp and rich, served with thin crackers nobody touches more than one of. A dessert. Tonight a light meringue with fresh berries, the meringue collapsing softly under the fork into something closer to sweetened air than cake. Coffee and mints to finish. Also at the table tonight are a Mr. and Mrs. Hollis, he a lawyer Charles knows through the club, she a quiet woman who spends most of the meal listening rather than talking, and a younger couple recently married, the Ardens. Still new enough to this circle that the bride glances now and then at the other women's plates as though checking her own instincts against a standard she has not yet fully learned. Mrs. Fairley herself presides at the head of the table with the easy authority of a woman who has given this same dinner, in one form or another, 100 times before. And she catches Helena's eye once across the candles with the warmth reserved for a guest whose company she truly enjoys rather than merely tolerates. 12 guests sit around the Fairleys' long table under a chandelier turned low enough to flatter every face in the room, and here is where the popular imagination of a 1920s dinner party and the actual dinner party Helena is sitting through part ways most sharply. The picture most people carry is one of gluttony matched to the era's reputation for excess. Plates piled high, wine flowing freely, everyone eating and drinking without restraint before the real party begins later that night. The reality, at a table like the Fairleys, is considerably more restrained than that, and considerably more exhausting in its own way. Helena eats the soup, 3 or 4 spoonfuls, and sets the spoon down before it is empty. She takes a single bite of the fish. The sorbet she finishes entirely. because a palate cleanser carries almost nothing in the way of substance, and finishing it draws no comment from anyone. The squab she cuts into small pieces and moves thoughtfully around the plate for the better part of 10 minutes, eating perhaps a third of what is served, timing her fork to the rhythm of the conversation so that a full plate being taken away looks, to anyone glancing over, like the natural consequence of an animated dinner companion rather than a deliberate act of restraint. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told, the sheer choreography of eating almost nothing at a table designed entirely around the appearance of abundance. A woman across the table, a Mrs. Whitfield whom Helena has met perhaps 3 times before tonight, keeps up a lively account of a trip to Newport while eating almost as little as Helena is eating, and the two of them exchange a brief, knowing glance partway through the squab course, the kind of glance that requires no words at all because both women recognize instantly exactly what the other one is doing. Charles, beside her, eats everything set in front of him with the straightforward appetite of a man who has never once had to think about any of this, and Helena watches him do it with an affection that has, somewhere underneath it, a thread of something else entirely, not quite resentment, closer to a kind of tired wonder at how uncomplicated a meal is allowed to be for him and how complicated it is required to be for her, at the exact same table, under the exact same chandelier. Between the fish course and the squab, one of the men at the table produces a case of cigarettes and offers them around, and 2 of the women take one, including Cornelia's own sister-in-law, seated further down the table. Helena does not smoke herself, has never particularly taken to it, but she has watched enough dinner parties by now to understand exactly what the cigarette is doing in that moment for the women who do reach for one. It arrives, deliberately, in the gap where a woman's hand might otherwise have reached for the breadbasket, and it occupies both the hand and the mouth in a way that a slice of bread never could, for considerably longer, without a single calorie changing hands. By the time the meringue arrives, Helena eats 2 small bites and pushes the rest gently to the side of her plate, praising it warmly to the hostess, because praising food one has barely touched is its own small social skill, one every woman at this table has mastered years ago. Nobody at the table remarks on how little anyone has eaten. Nobody ever does. It is simply understood, the way the untouched cocktails in the drawing room earlier were understood, as a fact of the evening that everyone present has agreed, collectively and silently, not to mention. Conversation after dinner moves to the drawing room, where the men eventually drift towards cigars and business talk near the fireplace, and the women settle into smaller groups near the windows. And Helena spends the better part of an hour talking with Dorothy and 2 other women about a Broadway show currently running, a scandal involving a senator's son that everyone has an opinion about, and, once more, briefly and in code, the general subject of managing one's figure through the autumn season ahead. A subject that seems to surface at nearly every gathering these 3 women attend, together, the way weather does. Dorothy leans in at one point to report, in a near whisper, that the actress currently starring in that Broadway show is said to live entirely on black coffee and boiled eggs during the run of a production, a claim none of them can verify and all of them repeat anyway. Because a famous woman's diet, real or invented, carries a certain authority in this circle that a doctor's advice alone does not quite manage. Mrs. Whitfield adds that she heard something similar about a different actress the previous season, and the 4 of them agree, without any of them quite noticing the pattern in what they have just said, that famous women seem to eat remarkably little for people whose whole living depends on being looked at. Near the fireplace, Charles and Mr. Hollis and 2 other men are deep in a conversation Helena catches only fragments of as she passes with a cup of coffee she does not intend to finish. Something about a margin call one of them weathered badly last month, a stock that everyone agreed was safe until it suddenly was not. A note of genuine concern under the easy cigar smoke that none of the men seem to want to examine too closely. Tonight, it passes for ordinary talk The kind men in this circle have every week, and none of them, Charles least of all, has any reason yet to think of it as anything other than the usual small weather of the market. Charles himself has a modest position in a few of the same bonds under discussion. Nothing reckless, nothing he has ever thought to mention to Helena over breakfast, and he laughs along with the others at some remark about a colleague's bad luck with the confident, untroubled laugh of a man who has never once seriously imagined that luck might run out on him too. Helena slips away from the group briefly to the powder room down the hall, where she checks her reflection under a considerably less flattering electric light than the drawing room's candles offer, adjusts a pin at her temple and studies her own face for a moment the way she studied her hip on the fitting platform that afternoon, before rejoining the party with exactly the expression she left it with. It is past 11 when the Whitcombs finally climb into the car for the short drive home, Charles pleasantly tired and talkative about a business connection he made over cigars, Helena quiet, watching the street lamps slide past the window, feeling, more than anything else, the fatigue of a body that has spent an entire evening performing ease while actually running on considerably less fuel than the evening required. Somewhere along Irving Place, Charles mentions, almost in passing, that young Arden's wife is apparently going to finish some course of study at a women's college before settling down properly, and he says it the way a man remarks on unusual weather. Not quite disapproving, not quite understanding the point of it either. Helena says only that she thinks it sounds sensible, and lets the subject drop, though she finds herself wondering, briefly and privately, what she might have done with a few more years of school herself, before deciding, as she usually decides when this thought surfaces, that there is no useful place to put the answer and returning her attention to the passing street lamps instead. The moment the bedroom door closes behind her is, without exaggeration, one of the better moments of Helena's entire day. Agnes is waiting to help, and the first thing to come off, before the earrings, before the shoes, is the girdle, unfastened and peeled away with a relief so immediate and so physical that Helena exhales audibly every time, a small, involuntary sound she has stopped trying to suppress in front of Agnes. Because Agnes, after 8 years in this position, understands exactly what that sound means and has never once commented on it. There are other nights, not tonight, but often enough to count as its own small pattern, when a dinner like the Fairleys leaves Helena truly hungry rather than merely accustomed to hunger, and on those nights she does something she has never described to a single soul, not Dorothy, not her own sister. She waits until the house is fully asleep, takes a candle rather than risk the hall light, and goes down to the kitchen in her bare feet to cut a slice from whatever bread Mrs. Doyle has left covered on the counter, spreading it thickly with jam from a jar at the back of the pantry shelf, eaten standing at the counter in under 2 minutes, the plate rinsed and dried and returned to its place before she goes back up the stairs. Tonight is not one of those nights. Tonight the 8 courses, thin as her share of them was, have left her merely tired rather than hollow, and the peppermint waiting in her nightstand will be enough. The mark along her hip is deeper tonight than it was this morning, a full evening's worth of pressure finally released, and Helena sits at her dressing table in her slip while Agnes brushes out the Marcel wave and begins the ritual that closes every one of these long days, cold cream worked into her face and throat with slow, circular motions, the thick floral scent of it filling the small room, followed by a chin strap fastened snug under her jaw and tied at the top of her head, an elastic contraption meant to discourage whatever softening might otherwise happen there overnight, worn to bed the way another era might have worn a nightcap. Before Agnes leaves for the night, Helena asks her, as she does most evenings, to draw a bath with a spoonful of bath salts dissolved into it, lavender tonight, and she sits in the warm water for longer than strictly necessary, feeling the tightness of the day finally loosen out of her shoulders and along the line where the girdle sat all day, the water doing quietly, privately, what nothing at the Fairleys' table was permitted to do openly. Out of the bath, she slips into a pair of silk pajamas rather than a nightgown, a habit she picked up only in the last year or two and now prefers, the fabric cool and light against skin that has spent the whole evening pressed and bound, and Agnes brings up a small tray before she finally says goodnight. A plain cup of chamomile tea, unsweetened, steaming faintly under the low lamp. Helena drinks it slowly, sitting up against the pillows, and it is one of the few things she consumes all day that nobody, not Dorothy, not Mrs. Lindqvist, not even Helena herself in her stricter moods, would think to count against her. Once the tea is finished and the cup set aside, once Agnes has gone up to her own small room on the top floor and Charles is already asleep in the next room over, Helena reaches first for the detective novel hidden beneath the peppermint tin and reads 4 pages by lamplight, enough to learn that the story's missing necklace has turned up somewhere it should not have, before she finally sets the book down, turns off the lamp, and lies back against sheets that whisper faintly against each other whenever she moves, the small dry rustle of silk against silk in an otherwise silent room. Only then does she do the thing she does most nights and has never once mentioned to anyone. She opens the drawer of her nightstand, takes out the small tin of peppermints, and eats one in the dark, the small hard sweetness dissolving slowly on her tongue. The one entirely uncounted, unaudited bite of the entire day, taken alone, by nobody's rule but her own. The world outside Helena's window is changing faster than anyone inside that quiet bedroom fully understands yet, and it is worth pausing to look at what is coming, because none of what we have watched tonight exists in a container sealed off from the years just ahead of it. Start with the plainest irony of the decade, one that sits just underneath everything we have seen tonight. Women in the United States have held the vote for 6 years now, since 1920. A change that took the better part of a century of organized struggle to achieve, and it arrived, as it happens, at almost exactly the same moment that fashion began demanding a level of bodily discipline from women that would have seemed extraordinary to their own mothers. Political voice expanded in one direction, while a kind of bodily latitude contracted in another, and almost nobody at the time seems to have connected the two changes out loud, though they were happening to the very same women, often in the very same year. 3 years from this September evening, in the autumn of 1929, the stock market will collapse in a matter of days. And households like the Fairleys and the Whitcombs will feel it differently than the households 2 blocks east that Helena passed on her way to the tea room. But they will feel it. Bond departments like the one Charles works in will shrink. Some of the men at tonight's dinner table will lose positions they currently consider permanent fixtures of their lives, and in the years that follow, the whole elaborate architecture of leisure and appearance we have spent tonight inside, the dressmakers on retainer, the tea room lunches, the reducing regimens pursued as a mark of status rather than necessity, will feel, to the women still practicing it, considerably more fragile than it feels tonight. Fashion itself will not stay still either. Within a handful of years, the straight, tubular, waistless silhouette Helena is wearing tonight will give way to something softer, a return of the natural waist, a new interest in the curve of the hip and the line of the bust that the current decade has worked so hard to erase. The Garonne look, the boyish figure so carefully cultivated at breakfast tables like this one, will come to seem, within a decade, almost as dated as the heavily corseted Edwardian shape seemed to Helena's own generation when they were young. Fashion, it turns out, rarely settles permanently on any single ideal. It simply moves the target, decade after decade, and asks a fresh generation of women to chase whatever the target happens to be this time. But here is the detail that matters more than the shifting silhouette itself, the detail worth carrying forward through every decade that follows this one. The underlying machinery, the bathroom scale, the magazine advertisement, the doctor lending his authority to a fashionable regimen, the private discipline practiced at a public table while nobody comments on how little anyone is eating. None of that machinery goes away when the silhouette changes. It simply attaches itself to whatever the new ideal happens to be. The specific foods change. The specific garment changes. The underlying demand that a woman's body answer to a standard set by forces well outside her own household does not change nearly as much as the fashion pages would have you believe, and it will still be recognizable in slightly different clothing for the entire century that follows tonight. Even the crash of 1929 will not undo it, though it will undo a great deal else. In the hard years that follow, when household budgets everywhere are cut to the bone and a full plate becomes something to be grateful for rather than something to manage, the reducing advertisements will keep right on running in the very same magazines. A little smaller perhaps, a little less lavish, but present all the same, because even in hard times, and in some ways especially in hard times, a slender figure will remain one of the few forms of wealth a woman can display on her own body without spending very much money at all. There is a slower change coming too, harder to date precisely, that touches the medical world Helena will never fully see from the inside. Within a generation or two, doctors will begin measuring food in a new unit almost nobody at the Fairlays table tonight has ever heard spoken aloud, the calorie, and what is currently a matter of instinct and etiquette. Eating lightly, being careful, being sensible will slowly become a matter of arithmetic instead. Numbers printed on labels and counted in notebooks, not so different from the one on Helena's own writing desk. The vocabulary will change entirely. The underlying behavior, a woman totaling up what she has allowed herself to eat in a day, will barely change at all. Constance, asleep upstairs in the nursery at this very hour, is 5 years old tonight, and she will grow up inside a world considerably different from her mother's. She will likely finish school. She may work, at least for a few years, in an office or a shop, something her mother's generation would have found faintly startling for a woman of their social position. She will live through a Second World War that will pull women into factories and offices in numbers nobody at this dinner table tonight could have imagined, and she will live long enough to see fashions cycle through the natural curves of the 1930s, the structured hourglass of the late 1940s, and eventually toward a slenderness every bit as demanding as her mother's, dressed up in entirely new language and marketed through a medium that does not exist yet in 1926. The television set that will eventually sit in her own living room. There is a kind of quiet mercy in not knowing any of this yet, sitting where Helena sits tonight. She cannot see the crash coming, or the war, or the shape her daughter's adult life will eventually take. She knows only the day she has just lived through, the grapefruit and the fitting and the 8 courses at the Fairlays table and the small private peppermint dissolving on her tongue in the dark. That is, in its own way, the most honest place any of us actually lives, in the single day in front of us, with the larger history moving underneath our feet, whether we can feel it moving or not. Let us step back now, before we close this evening, and look at the whole shape of the day we have just spent with her, because a single day, examined closely enough, tends to reveal patterns that a single day alone could never show you. Step back for a moment from Helena's evening, and a handful of patterns come into view. Patterns that a single day, examined slowly enough, tends to reveal in a way that no summary or textbook chapter quite manages to capture. The first pattern is the sheer invisibility of the labor involved. Nearly everything Helena did today required real, sustained effort. The careful pacing of a grapefruit over 20 unhurried minutes, the choreography of moving squab around a plate without appearing to refuse it, the discipline of a face that gives away nothing when a scale delivers its verdict each morning. And yet every bit of that labor was engineered, deliberately, to be invisible. The entire point of the performance was that it should look effortless, that Helena's slenderness should appear to be simply who she was, rather than something she built, hour by hour, meal by meal, through a level of sustained attention that would exhaust most people if they had to describe it out loud. We rarely count this kind of labor as labor at all, because it produces no product anyone can point to and no wage anyone ever paid for it, but it filled a real portion of Helena's waking hours today, as real in its demands as anything Charles did at his own desk downtown. Nobody will ever write Helena a reference for it. Nobody will ever call it a skill on a rusum, because there is no rusum for a woman in her position, and there is no name for this particular kind of labor beyond the vague, dismissive word we still reach for a century later. Vanity, as though pacing a grapefruit over 20 minutes while carrying on a lively conversation, were the same thing as glancing in a mirror. The second pattern sits close beside the first, and it concerns what slenderness was actually signaling in a city like this one, in a year like this one. We tend to think of a fashion for thinness as being, at bottom, about appearance, about how a body looks in a dress. But look again at the half grapefruit on Helena's tray this morning, set 2 blocks from a neighborhood where people genuinely could not afford enough to eat. Her thinness, cultivated at real cost and real effort, was doing a second kind of work entirely, announcing that she belonged to a class of women for whom eating lightly was a choice rather than a circumstance. A fact that had almost nothing to do with beauty in any simple sense, and a great deal to do with money, position, and the kind of visibility that comes with both. Put plainly, thinness in 1926 was doing some of the same work a fur coat did, or a chauffeured car, or a summer house on the shore. It announced, without a single word being spoken, that the woman wearing it did not need to eat the way a working woman needed to eat, and the announcement was heard clearly by everyone else in the room. The third pattern is the strange gap, sitting right underneath this whole decade, between what women had just gained and what they were still, in the very same years, being asked to surrender. Helena has held the vote for 6 years. She could, in theory, involve herself in politics, in public argument, in the kind of civic life her mother's generation was largely barred from, and yet the same years that opened that door narrowed another one considerably, demanding a level of bodily surveillance and self-management that would have seemed almost unthinkable to her mother at the same age. Expanded permission in one direction and tightened expectation in another, arriving in the very same decade, aimed at the very same women. It is worth sitting with how rarely those two currents get discussed together, as though political freedom and bodily freedom were entirely separate stories, when the women actually living through both were the same women, in the same bodies, at the same dinner tables. Helena's own brief flicker of curiosity over the morning paper, quickly folded away because there was nowhere to put it, is a small, ordinary example of exactly this gap, the door standing open and the room behind it still somehow out of reach. The fourth pattern concerns how thoroughly mediated Helena's closest relationships turned out to be, even the warm ones, even the genuinely affectionate ones. Her conversation with Dorothy over lunch about the vinegar grapefruit regimen was, on its surface, ordinary friendly chat between 2 women who care about each other. But underneath the surface, both women were also quietly competing, comparing notes on discipline, gauging where they each stood against an unspoken shared standard, using a code, regimen, careful, sensible, that let them discuss the most private facts of their own bodies without ever technically admitting to doing so. Even her marriage carries a version of this. Charles has never once been asked to explain his own full breakfast standing at the sideboard, while Helena's half grapefruit sits, unremarked upon and yet fully understood by everyone in the house as the appropriate portion for a woman in her position. Nobody negotiated this arrangement out loud. It simply arrived, fully formed, the way most of the rules governing Helena's day arrived, without a single conversation ever officially settling them. Even Agnes, standing just outside the visible boundary of all this scrutiny, is bound into the same unspoken arrangement from the other side of it, paid to notice everything about Helena's body and to comment on none of it. A silence that is as much a part of her job as the Marcel iron itself. The fifth pattern is the one that reaches furthest past tonight, past Helena, past 1926 itself. The specific rules change from decade to decade, sometimes dramatically, the tubular flapper silhouette giving way within a handful of years to a fuller, curved ideal, that ideal giving way in turn to something else entirely a generation later, and then something else again after that. Each generation of women tends to believe, understandably, that its own standard is simply the way bodies are supposed to look, the natural and permanent shape of beauty, rather than one costume among many that fashion happens to be wearing this decade. But the underlying mechanism, a standard set somewhere outside any individual household, absorbed as personal discipline, practiced privately and performed publicly as though it cost nothing at all, repeats itself with a consistency that should probably unsettle us more than it usually does. Helena's daughter will grow up believing her own era's standard is the true and obvious one. So, very likely, will her granddaughter, who will one day count a different kind of calorie in a different kind of kitchen, following a different set of tea room rules with a different set of friends, utterly convinced that her own generation has finally arrived at the truth about a woman's body that every generation before it simply failed to see clearly. She will be wrong in exactly the way Helena is wrong tonight, and exactly the way Helena's mother was wrong a generation earlier, each of them certain, in her own decade, that this time the standard is real rather than fashion, permanent rather than passing. The costume changes far more often than the underlying demand for a woman's body to answer to somebody else's specification. There is a sixth pattern worth naming too, quieter than the others but running underneath all of them, and it concerns who exactly was setting the standard Helena spent her whole day answering to. It was not one person. It was not even, in any simple sense, men, though men certainly benefited from a fashion industry and an advertising trade that both profited handsomely from women's dissatisfaction with their own bodies. The standard arrived instead through a whole diffuse machinery of magazine editors and fashion illustrators and advertising copywriters and the society physicians willing to lend their authority to a tablet or a tea room menu, none of whom ever met Helena, none of whom knew her name, and all of whom shaped her mornings more thoroughly than almost anyone she actually spoke to in the course of a day. It is a strange kind of authority, faceless and enormously powerful at once, and it is worth noticing that nobody in 1926 had quite worked out how to see it clearly, let alone push back against it, because it did not announce itself as authority at all. It arrived dressed as fashion, as taste, as the simple, agreed-upon shape of what was currently considered lovely. None of this, taken together, makes Helena a victim exactly, and it would be a disservice to her and to every woman like her to flatten the whole day into a single lesson about oppression and leave it at that. She was intelligent, disciplined, genuinely fond of her husband and her daughter, capable of real pleasure, real friendship, real private satisfaction in small unaudited moments like a peppermint eaten alone in the dark. She was also, at every hour of the day we have just watched, operating inside a set of demands she did not design and could not easily refuse, doing what people in every era do with an impossible standard, finding a way to live gracefully inside it, and finding, here and there, small private pockets where the standards simply did not reach. That, more than the grapefruit or the girdle or the gelatin salad, is probably the truest thing tonight's story has to tell you. Not that the 1920s were strange, though they were in their own way, but that every era asks something quietly unreasonable of the people living inside it, and most of those people, most of the time, simply find a way to carry it, without any fanfare, without anyone downstairs ever quite realizing how much it actually weighed. By midnight, the house on Gramercy Park has gone properly quiet. Walter has locked the front door and turned down the last of the downstairs lamps. Mrs. Doyle is long asleep in her room off the kitchen, the ingredients for tomorrow's breakfast already set out on the counter for the morning, a fresh grapefruit sitting in a small wooden bowl exactly where it always sits. Somewhere above, Constance is asleep with one arm flung over the side of her bed, and Bridget, in the small room next to the nursery, has left her own door open a crack, the way she always does. Helena is still awake, though not for much longer. The chin strap is tied. The cold cream has done its work and been wiped away with a warm cloth. She lies on her back in the dark with the window cracked an inch, cool September air moving the curtain very slightly, carrying in, faintly, the sound of a car passing somewhere over on Irving Place and, further off, the long low note of a ship's horn from the harbour, a sound that reaches this far uptown only on the quietest nights. Through the wall, she can just make out the steady, unhurried sound of Charles breathing in his own sleep, a sound so familiar after 8 years of marriage that she barely registers it as sound at all anymore. More a kind of proof that the house is exactly as it should be. Downstairs, a clock in the front hall marks the half hour with a single soft chime. And somewhere further down, in the kitchen, the last of the stove's heat is still ticking faintly as it cools, the whole house settling into its own version of sleep, one room at a time. On the writing desk across the room, closed now, sits the small leather notebook with tomorrow's page already partly filled in. A hairdresser's appointment at 10. A committee luncheon at 12:30, a fitting of her own this time rather than a friend's. And, in the corner, in the same blue ink as every other morning, a single word already waiting there for her, written some days ago when she first opened to this page. Careful, tomorrow has, in its own small way, already begun before tonight has quite finished. The way most of Helena's days begin, one page ahead of themselves, a whole life sketched out a little further in advance than most people ever get to see their own. The tin of peppermints sits back in its drawer now, the paper novel tucked beneath it, both returned to the same small hiding place they occupy every night of the year, waiting for tomorrow's 10 unguarded minutes the way the notebook waits for tomorrow's obligations. Between the two of them, the drawer holds nearly everything about Helena that never once makes it into a conversation, a whole private ledger running alongside the public one, and both of them, in their own way, get balanced every single night before she finally sleeps. She thinks, in the last clear minute before sleep takes her, not about the grapefruit or the girdle or the dinner she barely touched, but about the 10 unguarded minutes on the nursery floor this morning, tying a ribbon into her daughter's hair while nobody, including Helena herself, was keeping score of anything at all. It is a small thing to fall asleep thinking about. It is also, if you had asked her, probably the truest 10 minutes of the entire day. Outside, the city keeps doing what the city always does at this hour. Mostly nothing. A few lit windows, a milk wagon somewhere already beginning tomorrow's rounds hours early, the whole enormous machinery of the place idling quietly until morning asks something of it again. Inside, one house among thousands has gone dark. One woman among thousands has closed her eyes, and the ordinary weight she carried through this ordinary day has finally, for a few hours, been set down. That is where we leave her tonight, friend, in the dark, in the quiet. The day finally over and tomorrow not yet arrived to make its own demands. It was, in its way, an entirely unremarkable Tuesday in 1926. It was also, if you looked closely enough, and I hope tonight we did, a whole world folded into a single day, carried by a woman who never once thought of herself as carrying very much at all. There is a plain kindness in an ordinary ending, and I would rather leave you with one than with anything grander, without trumpets or any final twist. Just a house going quiet, a woman falling asleep, a city settling into the dark the way it does every night, whether anyone is watching or not. Sleep well now. Somewhere behind you, the lamp is already going out, and somewhere ahead of you, whatever tomorrow happens to bring, there is no need to be careful about any of it until morning actually comes. And that was a day. Just one day, in one life, a long time ago. Good night.